Hi, everyone. So I'd like to introduce Dan. Dan Raichel is the acting director of the Pollinator Initiative for the Natural Resources Defense Council. This mission focuses on protecting our nation's bee populations from the ever-growing threats to their health and existence due to pesticides. Tonight, we will also learn about how these pesticides affect human health. Prior to this, Dan was the co-director of NRDC's Fracking Defense Project and an advocate for the cleanup of industrial pollution in the New York region. Dan graduated from Cornell University and holds a JD from Columbia Law School. I've had the honor of lobbying with him on neonic pesticide laws in New York State. His passion for the issues is boundless. He leads in a powerful yet approachable manner, ever the teacher. Extremely generous with his time and an all-around great guy, Sawmill River Advocacy Committee is thrilled to present to you Dan Raichel. If you have questions for Dan, please leave them in the chat box and he could try to answer them after the presentation. Go ahead, Dan.
So, Kara, thanks so much for those kind words. And thank you all for having me tonight. So as mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about neonicotinoid pesticides and why they are so bad for bees, for birds, for New York's environment, and for the health of New Yorkers. But to start things off, and I know this is a bird crowd, but I have to start with bees. And as folks here may or may not know, bees are incredibly important. 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we take comes from pollination provided by bees and other pollinators. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, here is a picture of your typical grocery store aisle in the world that we live in, a world with pollinators and bees. And here's what that grocery store would look like in a world without them. So certainly we would still have food, right? We would just lose a lot of our most delicious and nutritious choices. And, what we'd have left would be quite a bit more expensive too. So beyond the grocery store aisle, bees are also hugely, and other pollinators are responsible for the well-being of ecosystems. Something like 80% of the plants on the face of the earth require bees and other pollinators to reproduce. So if we lose our pollinators, we worry not only about food insecurity, we worry about the collapse of ecosystems. And basically that's what we are worried about. So about 15, 20 years ago, beekeepers in New York and across the country saw their annual losses of honeybee colonies shoot through the roof, going from about 10, 15% a year, mostly due to winter cold, to 30, 40, 50% a year, virtually overnight. And those numbers have persisted to this day. They're basically the new normal. And this chart doesn't have the most recent numbers. It was the second worst year on record last year, the worst year in New York, actually, with over 70%. Beekeepers reporting over 70% of their hives lost. Wow. And something that's interesting too is the losses we see these days are not just happening in the winter, right? In some of the more recent years, we see that the summer losses are pretty close to even or even higher than the winter losses. And back in 2008, they didn't even count summer losses because beekeepers just didn't lose that many bees in the summer. So we know that something new and scary is going on, something that's driving these mass losses. And the good news, I guess, if you can call it good news, is that honeybees are livestock. So every year, beekeepers lose a phenomenal amount of bees, but there's a whole industry that breeds and replaces them. So we have about as many honeybee colonies as we ever had. They may be in rough shape, right? And the whole system might be held together with duct tape, but it's maintaining. We cannot say the same about our native bees and pollinators, right? There's no system that is breeding bumblebees and carpenter bees, etc. So we know in New York from a recent state-funded survey that about 40 to 60% of the pollinators in New York, which has 400 species of native bees alone, not to mention butterflies and other pollinators, which includes birds. And I believe though that this is insect pollinators. 40 to 60% are at risk of disappearing from the state. Those are huge numbers. And we know too that native bees are not just important to native plants, they're also really important to crop pollination as well. And there's a lot of recent research that has come out showing that production of fruit, vegetable, and nuts worldwide is down because we don't have enough pollinators. And in the United States, this is from a study that looked at apple and cherry production, apples being a hugely important crop in New York. And one thing that the study author found is that, wild bees are incredibly important too. So you can't just replace that lost pollination by getting more honeybee colonies. And it's also, I put this quote up here too, it's worth noting that our bee colonies, our honeybee colonies, are about as weak as they've ever been in history, and maybe one parasite pathogen away from having a major crisis when it comes to pollination. So, look, there's a lot of things affecting bees, right? There's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's parasites, pathogens, invasive species. Why are we talking about pesticides, and why are we talking about just one type of pesticide in particular? And I think to explain that, it's helpful to know what we're talking about, the neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. Neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, which means they are pesticides designed to kill insects by attacking their nerves. And the way they do that is they attach to insect nerves. It's actually the nerve sites that respond to nicotine. That's where neonic, the nick in neonic comes from. The word itself means sort of a new nicotine-like compound. So it mimics nicotine, gets into that nerve cell, and stimulates it. It doesn't let go. Unlike nicotine, which sort of stimulates the nerve and then detaches, these permanently attach, and they permanently stimulate that nerve until eventually that nerve dies. So if you've seen a bee that is acutely poisoned with neonics, oftentimes that bee will start to twitch uncontrollably before becoming paralyzed and dying. Now, a lot of other pesticides kill insects in gruesome ways too. Again, why neonics? There are three main reasons. The first is that neonics are super duper toxic to insects. They're among the most, if not the most potent insecticides ever created. And to give you a sense of scale, just one neonic treated corn seed can have enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees. These are phenomenally toxic, right? Somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 10,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT. And in fact, neonics, since their introduction, have made U.S. agriculture about 50 times more harmful to insect life. And this chart actually is one of the best ones for showing why we're so concerned about neonics. If you look at where that harmfulness spikes, and this is the light blue bar, the dark blue part of the bar is every other insecticide combined. If you look at where that harmfulness spikes, it's almost exactly at the point that we see those spikes in losses of honeybee colonies. So in a lot of ways, our honeybees, even though they're not native to the US, even though they're livestock, they were the canaries in the coal mine. The second problem with neonics is that they are so good at contaminating whole ecosystems. They are designed to permeate plants, get into their leaves, their roots, their pollen, their nectar, everything, and essentially to make the plant itself toxic to insects, right? To make the plant itself the pesticide, which was novel when they were first introduced, right? It's not like your grandfather's insecticides where you spray it on the plant, it kills the bug and it dissipates. These actually get into the plant. So that means they can be applied in all sorts of interesting ways. Of course, they can be sprayed, and they are sprayed, but more commonly they're applied to the soil or literally painted on crop seeds. So this is a picture of some neonic treated corn seed. Here's a close-up of some neonic treated corn seed. They don't always pick the same color. They just have to put a color on the seed to make people know that, hey, this is coated with a pesticide. And the idea is that as that plant is growing, it literally soaks up the pesticide coating through its roots and becomes toxic. So the problem is only 2 to 5% make it into the target crop. The other 94, 95+% stays in the soil where it persists for years, right? Years and years. And those same properties that allow the pesticide to get up into the plant also mean they're really mobile in the environment, right? Anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation, lawn watering, right? Depending on the application, those neonics are going to be moving through the soil. They're going to reach new soil. They're going to contaminate that soil. If there are plants in that soil, those plants are going to soak up the pesticides, right? They're going to become toxic, their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply nearby, that water supply is becoming polluted. Third problem with neonics is that they are all over the place, right? They're the most popular insecticides in the United States. And virtually every conventional corn seed in the US is treated with a neonic before planting. That's about 90 million acres, 90 to 100 million acres nationwide. Again, one neonic treated seed, enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees, 30,000 seeds per acre, and multiply that by 90 to 100 million acres with 1 million acres of corn in New York alone. They're also on about half to 75% of soybean acres, and all over all sorts of other crops as well. There's basically a neonic product for just about every crop that we grow. But neonics are also, all over landscapes that are not agricultural landscapes. They are very common in lawns, gardens, golf courses, you name it. And in fact, those areas are sometimes even we see higher concentrations of neonics because those uses are approved for much higher rates per acre. So you sort of get these toxic hotspots, particularly in suburban areas. And we've seen neonic use in New York go up and up and up. I know 2014 is not the most recent year. It's almost a decade ago, but it's the most recent year that we have data for the seed treatments. They actually stopped tracking those after 2014. But the trend lines in neonic use are only sort of more of the same. So we would expect the use to be about this or even more these days. But I'll bring folks' attention to this little red square here, which is the use of just one neonic, and that's the neonic imidacloprid. This is a map of imidacloprid use in agriculture, just in agriculture across the United States, and you can see how that growth has, expanded over time. And in New York, especially, again, these are just the ag uses. I know it's probably a little small for folks on the screen, but if you see these areas of New York where you don't see any use, like on Long Island and Westchester, you better believe if the non-agricultural uses were counted, those areas would be filled in, right? And if we were looking at the other neonics, we would have even more areas filled in, because remember, this is not even the most used neonic chemical in New York. It's the second most in New York agriculture. And I think, and I could be wrong on this, the last time I checked, I think the number 1 county in New York for pesticide use was Suffolk, and I think number 2 was Westchester. So, and certainly, right, a lot of neonics in both counties. And we see this, right? We see neonic contamination. The place that we see it more than anything is in water testing, because that's the one place where, sometimes these chemicals are tested for. And we know that neonics are the most common insecticide found in the Long Island aquifer. We know they're found in surface waters across the state at levels that are above each EPA benchmarks for harm to aquatic ecosystems. And again, a lot of these tests are just for imidacloprid. For some reason, imidacloprid is the one that people test for. And so we're probably not getting the full scope of the problem here because we're only looking at one of 5 chemicals that are used. One other thing to note about neonic water contamination, conventional chlorination does not take neonics out of the water. Only advanced filtration does, granular active carbon filtration, and most water systems do not use that. So, okay. Essentially what we have with neonics, and I should have mentioned this when we had the slide on the map, is that you have pesticides that are being used in the same places year after year after year. Most of the active ingredient is staying in the soil, right? 90+%. It's staying there for years, which means it's there the next year that the pesticides are used. So you have a buildup of toxicity in the soil year over year over year that is constantly expanding and getting into every nook and cranny of the ecosystem every time it rains. And so at some point you have somewhat ubiquitous contamination of the environment, soil, water, plant life, etc. What harms is that causing, right? Or what effects is that having? Well, one thing that we know, neonics are definitely killing bees, right? That is just scientific fact at this point. There was some discussion and debate 15, 20 years ago. We have a lot of science. Neonics are very harmful to bees and definitely driving those losses. But beyond bees, what else are neonics doing to the environment? As it turns out, a lot. So, as you might imagine, neonics are broad spectrum insecticides. They're not just killing honeybees, right? They're moving through food webs from the insects that bite the plants, that eat plants, to the insects that feed off of those insects. So we see neonics moving through food webs and killing other insect life, essentially hollowing out the ecosystem from the bottom up. And that impacts other good bugs that help farmers, right? The bugs that, the pest predators, right? The good bugs that eat the bad bugs. Also the bugs that cycle nutrients in the soil, right? That eat that decaying plant matter and return those nutrients to the soil. There's even some evidence that neonics are affecting microbial life in the soil that are important for plant growth and, again, cycling those nutrients. And this is probably more interesting to this crowd, but neonics are also have some pretty significant effects on bird populations. So a lot of birds eat insects. So if you have fewer bugs, you have fewer birds. And we have a number of studies linking neonic use, an increase in neonic use, to the losses of birds and bird biodiversity. And unsurprisingly, we see the highest correlation there, or the highest response with birds, insectivorous birds and grassland birds. And I think some folks may be familiar with that study that came out of Cornell a couple of years ago, 30% bird loss in the last 50 years. A couple of other scientists went into that data set later, which included Doug Tallamy, which some of you might know. And they looked at which birds were getting hammered, right? Which birds were losing population. And they divided it into the birds where insects were an essential part of their diet or reproductive cycle, and those for where insects were not essential. And as it turns out, for the birds where insects weren't essential, those birds have been doing okay over the last 50 years, and in some cases even increasing in population. Unfortunately, most birds rely on insects in some form or another, and those are the birds that we've seen really get hit in terms of population loss. We see the same thing in aquatic ecosystems. And this is from a study of Japan that cannot be repeated anymore. Scientists were doing a long-term data set looking at zooplankton, And for those who don't know what zooplankton are, here's a picture. They're essentially aquatic invertebrates or water bugs. And those researchers noticed that in the early 90s, the populations of zooplankton in this sustainable fishery that they were looking at hit a wall, right? And just dropped off, right? Flatlined. And that same year, they saw flatlining of the fish that fishermen would catch in that area. And so the question was, what happened there? And they later linked it to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. And Japan actually approved neonics just a little bit before the United States did. So this is maybe the first instance of neonics affecting an ecosystem. We see similar levels of neonics in water in New York. And let me tell you, it does not take a lot. The EPA benchmark is 10 parts per trillion. It's like 10 grains of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Very, very small amounts are toxic on a chronic basis. So, most likely, these sorts of impacts are happening in New York as well. You don't have to believe academics or even me. The US EPA recently came out with a very shocking finding that neonics are driving 200 plus species towards extinction, that they jeopardize the existence of those species. And for those who don't know the Endangered Species Act, jeopardizing even one endangered species is a violation of the act. I've never ever seen a finding that implicates more than 200 species. I mean, it speaks to how fundamentally destructive to ecosystems these pesticides are. So neonics don't just affect insects and things without spines, right? It affects vertebrate animals, including birds. And so, as you might imagine, and I'm sure a bunch of folks here feed birds, birds like to eat seed, and they do eat these crop seeds when they're planted in the spring, and oftentimes there's a mistake, a pile of seed doesn't get planted and is sort of on the surface. And we know that these seeds can have some pretty profound neurological impacts on birds because, as it turns out, our nervous system, the nervous system of vertebrate animals, also responds to nicotine, right? So just one neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird. And even at levels that don't kill birds, they can impair their ability to navigate, their ability to put on weight before migration. This is from that study of white-crowned sparrows. It found that birds just dropped a bunch of weight after eating neonic-treated seeds and couldn't put on the necessary weight to perform that migration. It interferes with their immune system, with their reproductive systems. So again, even if eating that seed doesn't immediately kill the bird, it could weaken the bird to the point where that bird would ultimately die, or that population would die if it interferes with reproduction. Moving to something a little closer to home, we've seen connections with neonics and neurotoxic effects in mammals. And there was a study several years ago that was started by some folks who had been hearing from hunters in the upper Midwest. They were seeing strange things with their deer, weird sort of jaw formation, malformations, and weird things going on with the organs. And there was some thought that it may be related to the increase in use of neonics in the area. So some scientists did a study, and lo and behold, they found in a controlled study that neonics were associated with, neonic exposure in the womb was associated with certain birth defects, including deformed jaws, decreased body weight and organ sizes, an actual increase in fawn mortality, which is a little scary. And then in the adults, endocrinological effects, right? Hypothyroidism, lethargy, etc. Now, the refrain from industry after that study was completed was, look, you can stuff a deer with any sort of chemical and you'll get an effect, right? Deer in the wild are not being exposed to these levels of neonics, right? It doesn't matter. Well, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources did a study where they collected spleens from deer across the state. And in 2019, they found some pretty surprising results, which is that, about 60% of the deer in the state had neonics in their bodies, with about 30% above levels associated with the birth defects and death in the Berheim study. They redid that study in 2021, and those numbers are way up. Now 94% of the deer sampled had neonics in their bodies, with nearly 2/3 at levels at or above the levels associated with birth defects and death in the Berheim study. That's crazy. Actually, when I saw these numbers, I was kind of shocked. But it speaks to the fact that, what you would expect, right? That we are going to be seeing an increase in neonics in our environment year over year. Where it gets truly scary is we see the same thing in people. So based on 2016 data, CDC and sort of their annual biomonitoring report, where they look at thousands of Americans, found that neonics were in the bodies of about half the American population on any given day. A more recent study of pregnant women in New York and 4 other states found that neonics were in over 95% of the women's bodies. And this is a more recent data set, right? 2017 to 2020. And those numbers, those levels of neonics they found increased every year of the 4-year study. And we see, even though we don't have data on neonics like we have for older pesticides or other chemicals like, lead or mercury, we do see neurotoxic effects, right, that you would expect out of a neurotoxic agent. We see birth defects of the heart and brain. We see exposures in the womb associated with autism-like symptoms, reduced cognitive ability. And then in adults, we see, sort of similar to the deer, right? We see these hormonal effects, endocrinological effects, effects on sperm and testosterone. So this is from a scientist, Dr. Phil Landrigan, really well-known children's environmental health expert, and did research on lead early in his career, and wrote an op-ed sort of comparing neonics to lead and sort of what was said about lead at the time, what we know about neonics now. And he likened sort of the situation we're in with neonics to where we were back then, which is, there's maybe, we see the connections, right? And at the time, in the 70s, the lead industry argued, hey, we know that lead exposures are associated with, in high doses, convulsions and seizures, et cetera. But if you have a small enough amount, then there's no problem, right? There's no such thing as silent lead poisoning. And since then, we've learned better, right? We know better now. And this is sort of what's important, because there's a lot of toxic chemicals in our environment. A lot of them are in our bodies. But what makes neonics so pernicious is they're designed to target our nerves, and nerve damage is permanent. So it doesn't take a lot, especially when it comes to children's health. And I'll tell you from my personal experience, when I started doing this work, our family switched to eating all organic, because I'm legitimately worried, right? I think there's something here. I think we do see neonic levels increase in the population. And I think it may be years until we understand what the full impacts of that are. And I don't think they're good. So it's worth noting that the risks here are not the same for everybody. The study in pregnant women, the Buckley study, found higher detections of neonics in the bodies of Hispanic women. And as mentioned, right, if you have the means, and my family does, we switch to eating organic produce. Not everybody has that option, right? Not everybody can buy a water filtration system for their tap if they're concerned about it. These are steps that people can take to reduce their risk of neonic exposure, but they're not available to everybody. And of course, if we have fewer pollinators and if food gets more expensive, that's going to hit food challenge communities the hardest. So we're going to move into what we can do in New York, which is important. But just real quick, what have folks around the world done about neonics? The EU banned almost all outdoor uses of neonics, at least for the 3 major neonic chemicals. Starting in 2013, there was a partial ban, which included neonic-treated corn and soybean seeds, and they expanded that ban in 2018 to just about everything. The US EPA, and I should note too, Quebec and Ontario have basically phased out the neonic-treated corn and soybean seeds, which are far and away the largest use of these pesticides. US EPA has not been so great on this issue. They came out with some proposals during the Trump administration, which basically continued to allow neonics at status quo rates, right? They never finalized those proposals. EPA is going to be issuing some new proposals, but I wouldn't hold your breath. EPA's pesticide office has historically ignored a lot of the risks associated with neonics, and they've done it with other chemicals too, Roundup, or AKA glyphosate, chlorpyrifos, etc. EPA's pesticide office doesn't have a really great history in terms of providing protections from these sorts of risks. A number of states recognizing that have already taken matters into their own hands. New Jersey, Nevada, and Maine passed significant restrictions on neonic use, basically prohibiting all lawn and garden use of the products in those states. And those states don't have a lot of corn and soybean, so that was most of the neonic use. That was the vast majority in those states. Other states, including New York, have restricted neonic use, so made them restricted use pesticides, meaning that they can't be purchased. Lawn and garden products can't be purchased at, say, Home Depot or Lowe's, but they're still applied by certified applicators, which means anybody who hires a lawn guy, right, is going to have a certified applicator, or they're going to have somebody that they contract with to perform those applications. So we still see in those states neonics all over the place, but there is a decrease because, again, you can't buy those over-the-counter uses. So the Birds and Bees Protection Act. The bill is a bill passed by the New York legislature. It's based on a massive study from Cornell University that grew out of Andrew Cuomo's Pollinator task force. It was state funded, and it looked at over 1,100 peer-reviewed studies. It came out in 2020. That was just about everything that had been written on neonics and pollinators at that time. But importantly, the paper looked at the costs and benefits of neonic use. Basically, if you got rid of neonics, what would replace it, right? And comparing those costs and benefits. Because an important question with pesticides is not only, hey, is the pesticide bad, but if we get rid of this pesticide use, what's going to take its place, right? And is that worse? So the report found 2 really important things. The first is that the neonic treatments on corn, soybean, and wheat seeds provide no overall economic benefits to farmers. To break that down a little bit more, very rarely do they provide a yield benefit. But even when they do, if you factor the extra cost of having the pesticide on the seed, because the chemical companies charge for that, economically it's a wash, right? So this is the largest use, it's the most widespread use, and also no real economic justification. The second piece is that the turf and ornamental uses, which are can be the most harmful to bees, right? Imagine putting a highly toxic poison on your pollinator garden. Those, like the seed treatments, often were used prophylactically and unnecessary, sort of like taking an antibiotic now just in case you might get sick in August. So most of the time not needed. But even when you would want to use an insecticide, and of course we would encourage non-chemical management of landscapes, but even when you might want to use an insecticide, there are a number of safer, effective alternatives available. So the bill eliminates just those two uses, right? It's a very narrow bill. It doesn't even eliminate other uses on corn and soybean, right? It eliminates just the coatings, the seed coatings for corn, soybean, and wheat seeds. There are a number of exceptions to make sure that if untreated seeds are not available, the prohibition could be relaxed, although we've seen in every jurisdiction that has put restrictions on these seeds, those seeds appear, right? And New York has a $100 million corn market. Seed dealers are not going to be walking away from that market, but there are protections in the bill. But even just addressing those seed treatments plus the lawn and garden uses, you get rid of about 80 to 90% of the neonics going into New York's environment. So it's an incredibly surgical, common sense, and effective bill, and it passed by large bipartisan margins in both houses. Oh, and I should note too, sorry, I forgot I put this slide in here. We've seen countries switch, right? Just over the border in Quebec, a couple of years ago, starting in 2019, the Quebec government required farmers to essentially get a prescription from their agronomist if they were going to use a neonic treated seed. So they didn't even ban these seeds, right? They said, if you want to use a neonic treatment on a seed, just go to your agronomist and have them write you a piece of paper that say you need it. And neonic use in corn there went from about 100% in 2015 to the last data we have is 2020, less than 0.5%. Neonic use in soybeans went from about 50% down to 0. And if you read this op-ed in the Albany Times Union by Louis Robert, it was published last month. It's a fantastic piece, just talks about the experience over there. Essentially, farmers switched and it was not a big deal, right? They got rid of neonics and they don't miss them. And that's just over the border. So what happened in New York with the Birds and Bees Protection Act? The bill passes the legislature by some pretty significant margins. The vote in the Assembly and the Senate was both bipartisan. And the bill right now is awaiting action by Governor Hochul. It's one of the last bills on her desk, or headed to her desk at some point, I should say. And, we know that the governor has been getting some pretty fierce pressure from the chemical industry, because even though farmers are not benefiting, right? Whether you're a corn or soybean farmer, you're at best breaking even. Apple farmers and other farmers that rely on bees are getting hurt. Everybody else's water supply is getting polluted, and the ecosystem is being hollowed out. But the chemical companies are still making money on neonics, right? They still make money from selling these things. So they really, really, really don't want this bill to pass, because they fear if New York moves first, as it has on so many important environmental issues, that the rest of the country will follow. And the same thing will happen as happened in Canada or Europe. So, right, the governor is getting some pretty fierce pressure. And we need to make sure that we push back against that pressure, because we only have until the end of the year until this can be decided. So there's a number of ways to get involved. I'm sort of using a slide that I've used before. There's a coalition letter. There's a petition. There's a coalition letter for organizations, and Sawmill River Audubon is on that letter and has been for a while, and we're very happy about that. We also have a petition for individuals that automatically sends emails to the governor. But a personal touch really helps, and I can circulate information to the after this in terms of what email addresses to send letters to. But personalized emails, or even better, an email and a paper letter, they're a little bit old-fashioned in Albany, is really impactful. A call to the governor is really impactful, right? They log these. They know how many people call and on what issue. And again, these can be very, very short. Writing op-eds, letters to the editor to your local paper is certainly helpful. Social media support, also super helpful. And I'm happy to say that we have an in-person event coming up very soon, coming up next week, a little less than a week away in New York City in front of the governor's office at 11 a.m. That's in Manhattan. That's the Manhattan office, close to 41st and 3rd. We're going to be doing a little bee rally there that will have bee scarves and posters and maybe some bee costumes. I can copy this and I can put it in the chat so folks have the information. But with that, I've talked quite a lot. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can go to questions.